If I told you that the world was upside down, you might be quick to agree with me. But what if I told you that the concept that we hold of North and South was upside down, or at the very least, completely arbitrary? And that by using terms like global North and global South, we're actually playing into the colonial agenda that was set centuries ago when these maps were originally created. So in recent years, it's become more common knowledge that the proportions of the map as we know it are misleading. With it being pointed out, for example, that Greenland on the map is being shown as being the same size as Africa and bigger than Australia, despite the fact that Africa is 14 times the size of Greenland and Australia 3 times as big. But these are not the only inaccuracies. The map that most of us are familiar with is known as the Mercator projection. And I want you to take note that this map was created at the time of colonial conquest. Now, it's often genuinely agreed that various groups and regions and people across the world would genuinely create maps based on their own biases or based on what's important to them. But the colonizers took this bias to a whole other level. Not only did they draw the map in a way that centered Europe and skewed the sizes of other countries, they strategically chose the north and south positioning to communicate Western colonial domination. Essentially, this map was created to drive colonial conquest, strengthening their ability to conquer both physically through better planning and navigation, but also psychologically through perceived power. The linguist Dr. Brian Harley argues that maps are a language that communicate power relations, and this is exactly what the colonizer did. As a child, I always used to wonder why Lower Egypt was placed above Upper Egypt on the map. Now, I now know as an adult this is because the ancient Egyptians saw north as being down here and south as being up, or rather, the map was just completely flipped. Now, one of the assumptions behind this flip was that the ancient Egyptians would see that the Nile ran this way and essentially assumed that north would be where the river started. And so they decided that north would be here and south would be here. Now, that is completely feasible when we think about the uniqueness of the Nile in that sense. However, it does beg a few questions, especially when we start to think about the fact that ancient Egypt is considered one of the greatest civilizations of all time that actually influenced ancient Greece. And so this idea that these so-called advanced civilization who were geniuses when it came to mathematics and science and all of this good stuff simply chose north and south based on this river becomes a little bit hard to believe. And this becomes even harder to believe when we actually learn that for a long portion of history, the Chinese and the Arabs also viewed the map in the same way. Throughout history, the north being up here and the south being down here was quite unique to this European era. And even prior to this new version of the map, in medieval Europe, east was at the top. Whichever way you look at it, what we know is that the concept we hold of north and south holds no scientific basis. But let me tell you what does. Brian Harley, the same linguist who argued that primarily maps communicate power dynamics, also found that we tend to process positive words as being somewhat higher and negative words as being somehow lower. In short, in most of our brains, north equals up and up equals good, south equals down and down equals bad. Now, obviously this makes sense when we think of the connotations that come with north and south. We think of north being up and forward and evolution, and we think of south as being down and backwards. We have connotations like everything was going well until it went south, I want to live in an uptown place, or so on and so forth. These binaries are heavily entrenched in our minds. Now, a psychological study by another Brian, Dr. Brian Mayer, found that when people were shown a hypothetical map and asked where they would like to live, they were more likely to choose the north. And that when another group of people were asked where the rich people would live on a particular map and where the poor people would live, they often positioned or pointed to the rich people being in the north and the poor people being in the south. This language literally changes the way that we perceive particular groups of people and also how we may go on to treat them. So by choosing to use this map, one, we are definitely playing into the colonial narratives and the colonial agenda. But two, when we actually use terms like global north and global south, especially in the context of international development, which is already steeped in a colonial history and rife with inequalities, kind of feel like this is a step too far. And it's also a step that is completely unnecessary. While using the terms global north and global south are quite a step up from, say, first world and third world, East and West hold much more neutral connotations than North and South. But even better, as more people are using terms like global minority and global majority, we can use majority world and minority world to support this important shift in perspective.